question we're dealing with right now is, how do you stop this genocide? Yeah, that's the question we've all come to sort of explore here this evening. And I won't repeat how we all know that the Zionist entity is inherently a genocidal entity. It was founded upon an ideology which is supremacist, racist, ethno-nationalist, and right from its very conception, it envisioned a Palestine without Palestinians. So that means it's woven into the DNA, this ethnic cleansing that we're seeing today. It's not something that started October the 7th, as we know, and it's been discussed earlier this evening. And we need to bear that in mind when we're speaking about how we're going to deal with the genocide. Because as we know, there has been unprecedented support on the streets of cities all over the world. We've never seen anything like it. It's been amazing, the solidarity that we've seen. We've seen the BDS movement never be so strong as it is today. But the slaughter continues. It's actually got worse. So why is that? It's because we haven't worked out, we have, which is great, us here today, most people haven't worked out that you can't stop a belligerent, rogue entity from realizing its goals with these actions alone. We know that this entity has F-16 fighter jets, 2,000-pound bombs, artillery strikes, predatory armed drones, armored tankers, incendiary bombs with white phosphorus, creating huge fire belts. So how do you confront all of this? You need a military force. And you need a force that is committed to taking on the Zionist killing machine. Now, the big question to this that we need to explore, and I'm going to do that quite differently tonight, is who is going to fill that role? And I want to say something that might be seen as controversial by some still, I hope it isn't, but there is absolutely no role for some sort of UN-backed international force in Gaza. There's a reason I say that. Yeah, because the origin, the structure, the organization, and the track record of the United Nations clearly points to the fact that it is part of the problem and not the solution. Yes, agreed? Good. And Gaza does not need another force which can serve as a means to further entrench Western control and hegemony in the region. We've learned from previous interventions in the Middle East and Africa that mandates of such international forces, and I'll say international in quotation marks, are shaped less by humanitarian principles and more by the strategic, political, and economic interests of powerful states who dominate policy in the region. Right. So what is needed is a regional solution led by the people of the region themselves. One which frees that region from Western dominance and Western colonialism. And I want to touch on 3 things, 3 points very briefly. I'll try to stay within my time. That speak to the importance of us turning our attention, as those who are involved in activism for Palestine, turning our attention to the Middle East or West Asia, the Muslim world. Call it what you want. But this is the direction we need to look in when we start to discuss the need for military intervention. So the first point I want to make is that this is a region which was actually prepared, deliberately reconfigured and restructured by colonial powers in such a manner that the existence, the consolidation, and the expansion of the Zionist entity has depended upon it. And we need to really reflect upon that point. This region was reorganized to welcome and to ensure the continuity of this Zionist entity. And the countries we see today, whether that's in the Levant, Palestine, historic Palestine, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, or further out, when we look to North Africa, we look to Egypt, these countries are a colonial invention. It is important that we understand that the formation of nation states in the Muslim world and in Africa, in this region, did not follow the same trajectory as European states. We need to acknowledge that. There is a history behind this. These states were actually carved out of what was previously a contiguous bloc, a bloc where people were interconnected for centuries through common cultures and governance based on Islam. This is the history of that region. These countries didn't exist. The borders that we see today on the maps were actually literally drawn by the British and the French after World War I. So we cannot view this region from a Eurocentric perspective through the lens that has been defined and shaped by colonialism. And those lines were quite literally drawn. Who knows about Sykes-Picot? Who's heard about Sykes-Picot? Can I have a show of hands? Right, we need more people to know about this. That's actually not enough hands. Sorry to those who didn't raise your hands. Right, this is integral to going forward. Because those lines were drawn by the French and British, literally, so the borders you see today, even the border around historic Palestine, again, some controversy, that border, the dagger shape, that was created during the British Mandate. Because we're talking about a block. We're talking about the creation of Jordan as an invented state. A border drawn in and that land carved up to create another state that would serve at the time British interests. So what's the impact and the implications of all of this on the issue that we're speaking about today, military intervention? Well, we need to bear this all in mind because that colonial fragmentation of the region into nation states over time has created an entire infrastructure that safeguards the continuity of the Zionist entity. First it was the British, the French, and now the United States. So we have to consider what that means when we talk about military intervention and what role we can play in taking this message forward. So if you look, for example, just a quick example, look at the south of this entity. You have Egypt. We all know about Rafah, yeah? We hear about Rafah often because of the siege and that being the point of entry from Egypt. Well, Egypt is bound to a treaty called the Camp David Treaty, which was agreed upon in 1979, and that treaty ties Egypt's military, its security, its economy to US policy in the region, and ultimately that means Israel's security. Egypt rakes in $1.3 billion a year, so it's second after Israel as the largest donor of American aid. And that is a trade-off where Egypt has given up a lot of its sovereignty. It's allowed a military multinational force called the MFO to be deployed in the Sinai desert, and that ensures demilitarization of the desert, so you don't even allow the forces to build up, which is slightly changing in the last 24 hours, something to look into. And so when we speak about military intervention, we need to know who's actually there on the ground, who's calling the shots. Similarly, this regional infrastructure ensures Israel's eastern flank is protected by Jordan, who can thwart any risks that may come from the Jordan Valley and prevent any resistance from the West Bank, emerging from the West Bank, which we see all the time with the raids, and just a few days ago, the 1,500 men who were taken from their homes and detained in Tulkarem in the West Bank. This happens with the complicity and involvement of Jordan. And Jordan too is rewarded with $1.6 billion a year in economic and military aid. So this infrastructure has to be addressed in order to confront the Zionist entity militarily. We have to start talking about it. It has to become part of our work and our activism. We have to absorb this in our activism. We have to start speaking about how is it that the region has close to a million soldiers, active soldiers, and many more reserve soldiers they can call up. Where are they? Why aren't they being utilized? So military intervention has a reality in that region, but something is blocking it. And these soldiers have the necessary training and the ordnance. These regimes spend billions on military ordnance, on equipment every year. This needs to be utilized, but why isn't it utilized? And that brings me really to a second point, which is that the call for military intervention has to be focused on this region, because the reality is there are over 200 million Muslims in the Levant. And that's a significant point because they are connected to Palestine, religiously, culturally, historically, geopolitically. And we have to take this into account when we're speaking about creating change, the demographics and the history of that region. And that's just the Levant. If we go beyond that and look at the Gulf, there's another 60 million and then more. And there are numerous surveys that have been conducted that highlight that the opinion on the Arab street is not in agreement with that of the client regimes, that there is not an appetite on the street. There is no appetite for normalization. You'd be surprised that some surveys have highlighted as little as 13% of populations from a number of countries in the region only 13% support any kind of normalization. They understand their governments have sold out. But But we know that these governments are repressive as well. So when people come out to protest, they do get arrested, they get detained. Hundreds of people have been arrested and detained in Egypt and Jordan since October 2023 for speaking out and protesting. And we know, all of us who are following on this genocide on social media, we know that when we hear the people of Gaza call out, there is a recurring message that occurs. Sometimes we see the subtitles, yeah? And that recurring sort of questioning is, where are the Arabs? Where are the Muslims? You abandoned us. And there's a reason for that. It's not because they don't believe anyone else has any humanity. You're all here today. There are many, many non-Muslims here today. Most of the people who march at the national marches are not from the Muslim community. But the reason they do call out in that way is because there is a very fundamental Islamic concept which is unique to the Muslims in terms of their affinity for one another, and that's the ummah. You may have heard of that word. And that is like an institution. It's a single body. It's often likened to a single body as an analogy. And belonging to that comes with obligations. And they're very aware of those obligations. So in those messages, they're reminding us, and they're reminding the region that you haven't done what you needed to do. And you need to wake up. You need to move. And they feel incredibly let down. I know many of us may be in touch with people from Gaza. I am, on a daily basis. And they do feel utterly abandoned by the people of that region. But it's not so much the people as it is the regimes. So to speak about military intervention, we need to start speaking about the need for people in that region to remove the colonial infrastructure which protects Israel, that protects it from facing military intervention from Muslim armies in the area. And there are millions of soldiers ready to fight if that order was given. We need to find a way, us people who speak out for Palestine, we need to find a way to support this region to mobilize. And that might sound difficult, or that might sound unrealistic, but we should be concerned with our efforts and how much we can project our voice at a time when we have access to so many platforms, as opposed to the result. All change starts somewhere, as we've spoken about today. And as people, and especially this is a message to those in the Muslim community, we are obligated to speak the truth. So we need to do that. We need to be able to direct this call for military intervention to this huge, significant bloc, to move them to adopt the call for themselves to the point that we recognize, and we can see on social media, even in the news, that we're going to see that the call has become inescapable in those societies because they have militaries that can be used and must be used. Very quickly and lastly, I have a message for the Muslims in the audience and those who are listening in, that we have to remember as Muslims, this is fard. That means it's an obligation. We are obligated to support military intervention. And from my work in the community, I can see that there is too much self-censorship and fear about this issue. I have visited many imams, speakers, community leaders. They know this, but they're scared to speak about it. They're much happier getting behind the mainstream activism because it's more acceptable. But that's not going to change anything. We've established that this evening. So I say to the Muslim audience who is listening now, remember the ayah in Surah Al-Nisa, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reminds us and says, what is the matter with you when you do not fight in the cause of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? When you do not fight for the oppressed men, women and children who cry out, our Lord, deliver us from this land of oppressors, appoint for us a savior, appoint for us a helper by your grace. And that ayah in Surah An-Nisa was revealed in relation to those who were left behind in Makkah and could not migrate to Medina and were still exposed to the persecution in Makkah. And this was then revealed. But it is applicable throughout time up until today, and it could be describing the situation in Gaza now, that people are calling out, where is the help? Where is the help? So I say to the Muslims who are listening, it's not a choice. This is an obligation. We need to start speaking about it. We need to start calling for it. And I say to everybody else who's here and is not from any particular faith, we recognize this needs to be done. We need to speak more about what the messaging is and how we get it out there and take that messaging to where it needs to be reached. Thank you very much for listening.